Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. Coming up on today's show, we'll discuss the scandal of the White House scandals that Republicans tried to use to take down Obama's presidency. Corporate America is making a killing literally by peddling dangerous products to American consumers, and we'll bring you all the details about that. And the dirty energy industry is ramping up their efforts to prevent clean, renewable energy from ever becoming a reality. Author Antonia Juhasz will tell us all about that story. We'll have all that and more coming up, but right now, you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
A few months ago, it looked like Republicans had everything they needed to take down President Obama. But as it turns out, their obsession over White House scandals proved to be nothing more than a complete waste of time. Joining me now to discuss the Republicans' obsession over these fake scandals is author Cliff Schecter. Cliff, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, man.
So, okay, first it was Benghazi, then it was the IRS, then it was the Justice Department spying on reporters. Take us back through all of these scandals that the Republicans were absolutely certain were going to help them impeach President Obama.
I know, it's amazing. You can actually go back further if you want to be really romantic and take a trip back through the Republican Congress. Remember Solyndra?
Oh, goodness.
Wasn't that a beautiful one? Yeah, I mean, we had the Benghazi scandal, which the Joint Chiefs of Staff made very clear was based on, there was a judgment made by the military that were in Tripoli, which is 600 miles away. They could not get there in time to help, and they chose not to. Then the scandal, so it wasn't the Obama administration didn't send people as they should have. Then suddenly it was who changed talking points, but it turns out the CIA. It had nothing to do with the Obama White House. And the real scandal is that some Republican took the emails and changed around what was said in them to try to make Obama look guilty. That's what should be investigated, actually.
Well, see, and I think it's great that you point out too that most Republicans cannot even point to Benghazi on a map. But I think what helped the Benghazi story sell on places like Fox News was that it is very difficult to understand. And when something is so difficult for people to comprehend, for them to wrap their heads around it, it can be reduced to the least basic of principles. So they're able to say, okay, well, there was an attack, Obama did nothing, he should be impeached. Ignore all of the intricate details that most people can't even understand anyway, especially this, Fox News audience. And that's what happens. They believe that Obama did something wrong here. But they overlook the fact that when George W. Bush was president, we had 13 different attacks on U.S. embassies all over the world. 98 people dead, dozens more injured. And there was not a word about that in any of this conservative media.
No, back then, Delroy Issa was probably still playing to boost his next car. It's amazing. And again, this is a playbook they've run. Remember, they couldn't defeat Bill Clinton, so they impeached him for sex. When they can't defeat Democrats, they couldn't defeat Eliot Spitzer, so there's some shady dealings about whether they use the Patriot Act to expose what he was doing. I mean, this is just what Republicans do when they can't win, because they believe they always deserve power. And when the public rejects them, as it does these days quite often, they'll find whatever they can. Now, there was no scandal in Benghazi, as you pointed out. I have friends in the Foreign Service who've been in diplomatic areas that have been attacked. When you're in certain places in Africa and Asia and other places, it's dangerous. Yes. This when you sign up for the job. It was a terrible tragedy what happened, but it was not unprecedented. You remember there was that storming of the embassy in Iran in '79. I mean, it's terrible, and I don't want to say that it wasn't a tragedy, but it happens. And they took something, essentially the deaths of Americans, and they tried to turn that into a political plus, which just shows how craven they are. But this is what they do. It's a Karl Rove playbook. If you go all the way back to how he used to win races in Texas, he found a couple of friendly FBI guys that would show up at somebody's office on the flimsiest of circumstances. They'd get their article on the front page of the newspaper the next day, and that's all they need. Then they had their campaign commercial. It's what they do.
Right. And they're not going to take, the Fox News audience is not going to take the time to look into what happened, to look at this. All they hear is, a guy like Steve Doocy telling them that, okay, the president lied to them, even though the president did not lie to them. It was the Republicans who altered those emails.
The Fox News audience is barely past fractions.
Well, and that brings us to the other topic too. I think the IRS scandal was one of the best ones that the Republicans had, because it was so overblown. It was so just not even sensical the way they were discussing this. And now recently we find out that it was actually a conservative Tea Partier at the IRS who said, you know what, we need to take a closer look at these guys. Has anybody bothered to mention that to the guys over at Fox News or to the Koch brothers, sponsored Tea Party rally?
I don't think anybody has mentioned, or if they've got that sort of bubble they sit in. So if it's been mentioned to them, it's just easily ignored, like all other facts and weird things like science and medicine. They wanted that to be a scandal. That was just perfect for them, right? The IRS, they're coming to take your taxes, and they're doing it to you because you're conservative. You have to pay taxes to big government, and you're a conservative, so they're targeting you. I mean, it just fit it checked really most of the paranoia boxes perfectly for them. And it turned out, you're right. First of all, the guy who was running things there was a right winger. Second of all, turns out, guess what? They were searching for groups that had the word progressive in it too, and other words like that. Because the truth is with under our current law, thank you, right-wing Supreme Court, a lot of C4s are pretty shady overall, whether they're on the left or the right. Whether they're supposed to educate, but let's be honest, they're often involved in political activity beyond where they're supposed to be. And so these guys were doing their job, and they were looking into it. But of course, Darrell Issa knew what was going on. He knew what he'd heard in private testimony, and he sort of selectively leaked all the items that would make people think it was a conspiracy to go after the right. Thankfully, Elijah Cummings started releasing the entire transcripts to show that was just a bunch of bunk. But again, Darrell Issa is literally just a two-bit con man who found his way into millions after stealing cars and and potentially burning down his own factory, which is still one of these things that's suspicious 30 years later. There's plenty of stuff to investigate, as there always is with conservatives. It's just that's not what gets investigated. I mean, the fact that the Interior Department under George W. Bush was busy trading favors for prostitution, for prostitutes, and for being bribed, and that was probably only the 25th highest scandal after Katrina and lying our way into Iraq. And what was ignored before 9/11, and you can go on and on and on. Exposing Valerie Plamb's identity. The politicizing of the U.S. attorneys. Right. I mean, nothing Obama has done would make the top 100 Bush scandals. But don't tell the Republican Congress, who never bothered to look into any of those things.
Right, and so. Okay, all of these scandals went absolutely nowhere. It was a complete waste of our time. Even
and
when they called, and money. Even they called Eric Holder in to come, testify about the Justice Department spying on reporters. That was a waste of time. It was a waste of our resources. It produced nothing. Meanwhile, since they know they can't win anything on these scandals, what we're seeing start popping up all over this country is now they're bringing back the culture war. Now they're going back after this war on women that worked out so well for them in last year's election, but they've brought it up again. These people don't learn. And when they are frightened, when they're backed into a corner, they will always go back to these culture war issues.
That's right. Well, you brought it up well. They're like, when you have a trapped animal, I mean, that's what they are, because they don't have a part of the brain that does logic. They just do fear and paranoia and anger and the rest. So you're right. They go back to the issues that motivate their base. Oh my God, women have control over their bodies. Let's take that away. Oh my God, two men actually love each other. Let's go after that. They go to those sort of base issues because they've got nothing in the end. And the truth of the matter is that with the exception of about 15 states in this country, every other state is becoming more demographically a state where Republicans can't do this stuff and win. So what do you do then? Well, you pass Citizens United, you let the Koch brothers and local Koch brothers in different states try to buy elections. You go after the Voting Rights Act so that they can try to disqualify parts of this growing Asian, Latino, African-American, college-educated white and female growing coalition. on the Democratic side. You do everything in your power to try to sort of win by cheating, because what their policies are appeal to maybe 20%, 30% in most of the electorate.
Right, and it's important to remember too that even in the South, the demographics down here are shifting to become more progressive, and so that's why we're seeing people like Rick Scott institute all of this gerrymandering to make it to where Republicans can win in districts where statistically they shouldn't be able to. Helped in part by the Supreme Court striking down parts of the Voting Rights Act. That's going to be terrible in the upcoming midterm elections next year. And then we also have corporations who can pour money into races all over the place. I know a great example is the fact that Michelle Bachmann, of all people up in Minnesota, raised millions of dollars from companies down in South Florida. Before Citizens United, that wouldn't have been allowed. But more importantly, people need to look and ask themselves, why does a company in South Florida have any stock at all in somebody like Michelle Bachmann?
Right, and then you watch, in her case, she won't be running again because she's all sorts of corrupt. It looks like a legislator in Iowa to support her campaign. But if she were running again, you'd want to look, or maybe even in the meantime, at her voting record. And magically, you find her voting in favor of things for said South Florida company that she should otherwise have no interest in and nothing to do with. I mean, it's such corruption. It's sort of sickening. The fact that the Supreme Court could say that this could occur and it wouldn't be the appearance of corruption shows that they're bald-faced liars. You can't really trust them on anything. And John Roberts, for that matter, he tries to smooth it all over. These guys are politicians and rogues. They're not really judges. Just keep in mind that at one point in time, both Louis Gohmert and Jeff Sessions were judges. They were actually charged with judging stuff. So, I mean, that's what you've got. And you bring up Florida. Look, Florida, it started happening 10, 15 years ago. At this point, Virginia is a swing state. North Carolina, Obama won once and is a swing state. Georgia's demographics are such that they nominate one of these lunatics like Paul Brown, or one of these other people that thinks evolution comes from the pit of hell. Obama only lost Georgia by 7 points. It's quickly becoming a swing state, too. Eventually, South Carolina in 15 years will get there, and Texas is on its way. So, demographically, what they believe in is going to be something that's hugely popular in Wyoming and Oklahoma and Alabama, but in most of the country, where the demographics are changing in enormous ways, to quote their Christianist friends, they're going to be left behind. And that's why they have to do these things like what you're talking about with voting rights and with pouring big money into elections, because if you don't have the playing field tilted hugely in their direction, they'll get wiped out.
Right. Cliff Schecter, author of the best-selling book, The Real McCain, president of Libertas LLC. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on, Farron. I appreciate it.
Coming up, we'll find out why corporate America thinks it's okay to make billions of dollars off the deaths of American consumers. I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. Some of the biggest money makers for corporations also turn out to be some of the most deadly products for American consumers. And in spite of the risks associated with their products, corporations seem eager to sell us products that'll put us in the grave and put billions of dollars in a CEO's pocket. Joining me now to talk about the ways in which corporate America profits off consumer deaths are attorneys Howard Nations and Peter Burg. Howard, let's start with you. I mean, I know if you go back through history, corporations have had this long, sordid history of selling us products that are going to kill us. And I think one of the oldest ones out there is asbestos. Tell us a little about that.
The asbestos story is pretty amazing, Farron. As early as 1898, it was recognized in England that asbestos dust was extremely dangerous. And we kept mining it here, and in the 1920s, when the lawsuits began against Johns Manville, they lobbied Congress and they got a national legislation passed that said that these should be treated as workers' compensation cases. The effect of that is denial of trial by jury. They were handled administratively as comp claims, because if there's anything that these corporate terrorists really fear, it's a trial lawyer with the right to discover, get into their books, get into their documents and discover them, and then present that to a jury. So the first thing Johns Manville did was set aside the right to trial by jury. Then they funded phony medical studies. Eventually, independent medical exams linked the disease, several diseases, including, of course, mesothelioma, to the asbestos. In an internal memo, it's pretty indicative of their attitude. This was actually from a corporate discovery. The internal memo actually says, quote, "If you have enjoyed a good life from working with asbestos products, why not die from it?" Can you believe that?
That is completely indicative of the corporate mentality of the time. And asbestos, you know, as you said, the industry worked very hard to prevent any of these cases from going in front of a jury. And a large reason for that is because in public, the companies were telling us that there is no possible way a human being would get sick from asbestos. While on the other side, in private, their internal memos showed that they knew this was happening. I believe, you know, by the 1930s, a lot of these memos came to light, but they had known for 40 years prior to that. And even today, we still have over 100,000 deaths every year from asbestos. I know there's a lot of companies in Canada that are still mining asbestos. They're sending it all over the world. So this is not a case or a product that is, you know, outdated or irrelevant today. It's still being used. It's still out there on the market. And speaking of products still on the market that are killing people, Peter, let me go to you. I think tobacco is one of the biggest ones we have out there today and has been for the last 50 years. You tell us the tobacco story on how they're making billions off killing their customers.
Farron, it's amazing how soon we all forget with tobacco. You go back to the 1940s, and the tobacco industry, the information was readily available to them, that internally they understood the risk and perils, including death, and a horrible death from tobacco. And yet they went out and they lobbied and they promoted and said over and over the years, and did so very successfully with their lobbyists among Congress and so forth, to not have it be regulated. And for years and years, I'm old enough that I remember all those TV commercials promoting tobacco, and some of them to children. That was part of their actual strategy, Joe Camel being one of the most infamous that we all heard about.
Right. Well, you can also, I mean, you can go on YouTube, you can find clips where they have, you know, Fred Flintstone selling Winstons.
Absolutely, because it's all about profits over people. And they were willing to do whatever they had to do throughout that time period. I mean, those of us who remember, you can't forget in the 90s, 1994, the 7 CEOs of the 7 largest tobacco companies testifying before Congress and telling us nicotine is not addictive. Outrageous, when in fact their own internal information and information in the science community told us just the opposite. And I think the other thing, when we look at the tobacco story, that is really important today is not only what the tobacco companies knew but were not disclosing to the public, but the fact that they were actually doing things to make it look less harmful, while in fact they were adding things to the particular product that was making it more addictive and more harmful. It's just outrageous.
Right, and they still today try to dupe consumers by selling light cigarettes or what they call low tar cigarettes, and such a thing does not exist. In fact, studies have shown that if somebody is actually smoking what they call a light cigarette, which may have less tar, may have less nicotine, but they hit it harder and they smoke more often, so they're actually doing more damage to their bodies by purchasing these light cigarettes. And you know, I want to switch gears a little bit here too, because Howard, you know very well about another product out there, which is lead. You know, there was a time when we had lead in our gasoline, we had lead in our paint. It was all over society. And this, you know, lead, for lack of a better term, is toxic to human beings, correct?
Very, very much so. In fact, this is one of the most shocking stories that you'll find, that in the 1980s they discovered that lead paint and lead in gasoline, the average American lost 6 IQ points from exposure. But listen to this statistic. in the percentage of our population that were determined to be intellectually gifted decreased by 40%. The percentage of the U.S. population that were determined to be mentally challenged increased by 40%. And the studies relate lead poisoning to antisocial behavior and criminal behavior. And for a 50-year period, GM, DuPont, Standard Oil, and American Petroleum Institute lied about the lead hazards and lobbied to keep it on the market. A typical example, and this is a standard pattern, the Ethel Corporation from 1964 to 1981, when they were being heavily attacked in the United States, increased their production overseas of lead products. And that's what they do. When you take a product off the market in the United States, they move it to countries where they do not have product liability laws. But the biggest single issue on this, the World Health Organization said that lead gasoline was, quote, the mistake of the 20th century. But the thing that blows your mind, listen to these statistics. The United Nations Commission report the annual cost of lead in gasoline, the annual cost, at 1.1 million deaths, 322 million lost IQ points, 60 million crimes, and then a total of $2.4 trillion in losses from the decrease in the global domestic product. And the major problem we're facing today is that lead doesn't degrade, it's not combustible, it's never destroyed. We have a globe that is covered by it right now. And the ultimate irony is that lead did not benefit engine performance.
You know, I think what's very interesting about this story is that the ancient Romans actually understood how dangerous and how deadly lead could be. You know, they associated madness with it. They understood it, and yet corporations today in the last 100, 200 years said, okay, well, maybe we've known about these risks for several thousand years, but it can make us money, and money is more important than the safety of the public. And that actually brings us to the next industry, Peter, which is big pharma. I don't think anybody has done a better job of selling deadly products, except maybe tobacco, than big pharma. Tell us what's happening with them.
Yeah, you know, there is a war on drugs out there, and it's a war on drugs on us as consumers by big pharma. I think one of the more interesting statistics on that has come to light recently is the alarming rate of death that women are experiencing with painkillers and prescription drugs. We've seen a 5-fold increase in these type of deaths in women from 1999 to 2010, according to studies done by the CDC. And it's alarming. Now, women are still behind men in total number of deaths, but the increase is the result of just a massive supply flooding the market with these painkillers. And women are particularly vulnerable because they suffer more than men from things like chronic pain. It's horrifying. I was looking at 48,000 women killed between 1999 and 2010. Over 6,000 died in 2010 alone from Vicodin and OxyContin. What are we doing to our public? And the answer is that if Big Pharma can make money, they're going to promote these drugs. And there isn't a lot of consumer protection these days. One of the big issues recently we know, and I'm sure it's a topic we'll discuss, is Bartlett. What's recently happened with the Supreme Court in terms of a 5-4, the Roberts Court really embracing the needs and wants of Big Pharma, adverse to consumers. Particularly, we got a dynamic where consumers are taking more and more generic drugs and are being left without much of a remedy, if any.
Right. And Howard, we've only got about a minute left, so in that last minute, can you give us your thoughts on the Bartlett decision and what that's going to do for American consumers? Well,
80% of drug users use generic drugs. the effect of the Bartlett decision in conjunction with the Mensing decision from 2 years ago by the U.S. Supreme Court is that those drug users, generic drug users, no longer have the protection of state laws. They have lost their right to prosecute a drug company if they have a defectively designed product or if they fail to adequately warn. It's all because of a simple rule of the FDA. And the Supreme Court said in Mensing 2 years ago, they said this is not for us to fix, this is for either the Congress or the FDA. The FDA has been, they've been approached about this, they've had petitions filed, they've been contacted by Senator Leahy and others. They chose to do absolutely nothing. All it would take to solve this whole thing is a simple rule change by the FDA, a simple rule change. They have failed and refused to do it. And
well,
yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, the main reason that's not going to happen is because the FDA is completely captured by the pharmaceutical industry with the revolving door of people coming from the FDA to Big Pharma, from Big Pharma to the FDA. But unfortunately, we're out of time. So Howard Nations, Peter Burg, two of the best attorneys out there, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
When we come back, we'll find out how the oil industry is preventing renewable energy sources from being fully developed. I'm Farron Cousins, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins, and for Mike Papantonio this week. The fossil fuel industry has a stranglehold on American energy production, and not surprisingly, they're also the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the country. Polls show that the American public is more than ready for alternative energy, so why are we almost completely dependent on fossil fuels? Joining me now to help answer that question is author and investigative journalist Antonia Juhasz. Antonia, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So back in the year 2000, BP, formerly British Petroleum, in this grand gesture, actually changed their name to Beyond Petroleum. The goal from that was, we're moving past oil. We're getting out of fossil fuels. We're going to invest our money into clean, renewable energy. So what's happened in the 13 years since that rebranding?
Well, and just to make clear, it was a rebranding. So they went to an advertising agency. The advertising agency said, oh, wow, we noticed that you spend 5 cents on alternatives. Let's talk about that. And that became the rebranding pitch, not because BP was suddenly going to throw a massive amount of money into alternative energy, but rather the advertisers noticed that they spent a little bit already and said, let's talk about that instead. So this was more of like a result of things like focus groups, clever PR tactics, had little to do with investing in alternative energy and everything to do with the public's perception of the company. Yeah, actually, one of the ad men who worked on the initial campaign after the huge oil spill in Alaska with BP's pipeline rupture, that's even before the Deepwater Horizon, he basically wrote a mea culpa op-ed in the New York Times saying, wow, if I had known this was such a bad company, maybe I wouldn't have helped come up with this, advertising pitch. But he did, and they did, and it worked very well for them. So they rebranded themselves Beyond Petroleum. They used the new logo, which looks like a sunburst. And they did invest money in alternative energy. I mean, to be clear, they have invested money. The problem is that it doesn't in any way live up to the rebranding. They are hardly Beyond Petroleum. Moreover, while they've continued to portray themselves as a company that invests heavily in alternatives, they have in fact divested away from alternatives. They've sold away their solar sector, they've sold away virtually all of their wind sector, but they haven't changed their commercials, and they certainly haven't changed their logo, and they're riding on the perception that they are a green company when in fact they are far from it.
And BP is not the only ones, who are guilty here. I know a lot of the other companies, you have Shell and Chevron, who, rather than investing in alternative energy, they're just basically doubling down on oil production. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's the trend I found with all the companies. So I did this article for Rolling Stone that appeared on Rolling Stone's website, where I was really able to spend the time and crunch the numbers. So I went through literally thousands of pages of tax returns, filings with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, corporate responsibility reports, sustainability reports, advertising budgets, and found that for all the major oil companies, they basically reached a peak probably in 2006, 2007 for most of the companies on actual expenditures in alternative energy. And as a proportion of their other expenditures, the amount of money they're spending on alternative energy is just disappearing, with many of them moving out of the sector altogether. So Shell has divested out of its solar business. It's mostly out of wind. As we said earlier, BP is out of both wind and solar. Chevron has a teeny bit of solar, but that work is done through a private subsidiary, so you can't see the numbers. And the numbers I was able to see, this percentage of their other expenditures, which of course are massive, the percent going to anything remotely resembling alternatives, and this is a very broad category because I'm using their numbers, has gone down and down and down and down. The reason why is, as you say, the companies have had whole new areas of opportunity open to them to double down into much dirtier forms of oil. They're going deeper into the oceans, including the Arctic. They're going much more heavily into tar sands, into shale production in the United States, natural gas production. We are fighting wars that have resulted in very large amounts of oil being made open to companies that didn't have access before, with all of the companies going heavily into Iraq and Kurdistan. And so they're doubling down on these heavier forms of oil and backing away from alternative energy. And they're not losing much because the public thinks they're still invested in alternative energy.
Right. And, you know, under Obama, I mean, oil drilling, which, you know, is not necessarily his doing, but oil drilling across the country has reached, you know, a 20, 25-year high. And we're opening up new lands. We're opening up federal lands for oil companies to come in and plunder at their will. You know, we've opened up new expanses of offshore areas for them to drill. You know, and you know, Shell is doing quite a bit in the Arctic. I know some of it's been paused, especially after their rig broke loose back in December and January. But you know, I know Obama recently came out and said, well, we've got to do something about climate change. We've got to do something to get off our, you know, oil addiction. But in the next breath, he tells us that we're gonna go ahead with fracking. We're gonna open up new lands for oil drilling. You know, we're gonna do some clean coal technology, which is a misnomer in itself because clean coal doesn't actually exist. But all that allows these companies to do is to go out there and further plunder the earth.
Yeah, I mean, we've reached record highs in domestic production, and that was policies begun under George Bush that have continued under Obama. The idea that we are reaching domestic energy independence. The reality is that very wonderfully, through policies that have been put in place by Obama and because of hard work by activists and American consumers, U.S. consumers reached their peak of gasoline and oil consumption in 2007. We've been on a decline ever since then. The increased production that's taking place in the United States some of it is feeding our quote unquote energy independence, but a lot of it's just being shipped out of the country. So there's been also an increase in exports of oil and exports of gasoline out of the United States while we're drilling more here because the oil companies can make more money elsewhere selling that product, and we're doing a really good job of reducing our consumption. Since we're reducing our consumption, let's reduce our production as well. If we care about the climate, we also have to care about under what conditions we allow companies to operate. What we've done is allow them to move into dirtier, more polluting forms of production, more dangerous. There was just a train derailment this weekend of oil actually moving out of North Dakota into Canada by rail. The train derailed, had a massive explosion, at least 5 people dead, and a city basically, or a town basically floored because of this derailment. We're allowing these more dangerous, dirtier forms of production to happen, and that is moving us in the wrong direction of trying to protect ourselves from climate changes.
Right, and well, we saw back in April when Exxon's Pegasus tar sands pipeline ruptured in Arkansas, spilling this toxic dilbit in people's backyards. You saw the pictures of it coming through neighborhoods, going down the street, and this is the stuff that they're saying is a better investment for them as a company than investing in wind energy and solar energy, in geothermal, in biofuels. This is what they want. They want these pipelines coming through our backyards. That's why there's still this continuous heated push for the Keystone XL pipeline. And the Keystone XL will do absolutely nothing for American energy. And they've been able to sell this idea that we need more oil drilling in the United States, one, because we need to be energy independent, which isn't completely untrue, but two, because it's going to lower the prices that we pay at the pump. But even if we were to drill in every available open land in the United States and open up federal lands that are currently off limits, we would only bring in enough oil to fully sustain the United States for, I think, 1 or 2 full years. And then that's it. And so they've sold this talking point that it's going to lower our prices, but at the same time, if we're at a 25-year high, gas prices are still climbing. So why do these energy companies not understand that renewables are the only way to sustain themselves in the future? I don't understand that mentality. Maybe you do.
Well, to be honest, what I think is that first the American public needs to know, the global public needs to know, that the oil companies are not green companies. They aren't trying to be, they just want us to think that they are. They don't think that their bread and butter is going to go away anytime soon, and that's oil and natural gas. And they believe that we will let them go anywhere, drill anywhere, under any circumstances to get every last drop of that product. And that's what they're doing, and that's what they're betting on. Now, I actually would like people to know that, but I don't want the oil companies to become alternative energy companies. I've already seen what they've done with the natural resource they've been working with so far, and I don't like it. I don't want them controlling the sun, controlling the wind. I don't want them moving into those areas. What I think they should do is be honest about their investments. One thing that will do is remind the public that these are dangerous companies that need to be monitored like dangerous companies. They're not in wind and solar. They're not in what we consider safer production areas, which are wind and solar is much safer than oil and natural gas. We have to keep a close eye on them. We have to regulate them. We have to constrain their operations, and we have to maintain intense oversight. And what I would like is for the oil industry to use all of that money that it has while we remain dependent on their resource to run the safest, most humane, best operations possible, whether it's their production, their transportation, their refining, everything they do with this product. While we have to depend on it, I want them to use those billions and billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars that they have to do it to the best of their ability, which they're absolutely not doing now. They're running roughshod over regulators and regulations, and they're doing, self-regulation, which clearly is failing, yet they have plenty of money to do it well. So that's what I'd like. I'd like the public to know the reality of these investments, that it's our responsibility to force the companies and force the government to regulate the companies, and then to force the companies to actually use their money to do the best operations that they can, while at the same time we do everything we can to get off their product.
Right. And, I agree, especially if the U.S. government is going to be subsidizing these companies to the tune of roughly $4 billion every year. You would think that a company like Shell that already, made $23 billion in expenditures could afford to maybe spend a little bit more than $400 million investing in alternative fuels. But it's always going to be profit, profit, profit for these companies. And until they suck the last little bit of oil out of the grounds here on the United States, that I personally don't think that that's going to change. But Antonia, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Antonia Juhasz is the author of the books Black Tide and the Tyranny of Oil, and she's also a fellow of the Investigating Reporter program at UC Berkeley School of Journalism. Just ahead, we'll be discussing the consequences of allowing major corporations to sponsor scientific research. We'll be right back, so stay with us right here on Ring of Fire.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins, and for Mike Papantonio this week. Research conducted at major universities helps lay the groundwork for new consumer products, new drugs, as well as the dangers of existing products, chemicals, and other byproducts of corporate America's activities. Since this research plays such a major role in how corporations operate, it's no wonder why corporations would jump at the opportunity to sponsor academic research. And I have investigative journalist Darwin BondGraham with me now to tell us what corporate money is buying at American universities. Darwin, I know over the last few years, really, we've seen this massive influx of corporate money into universities, but I think recently the University of California has kind of gotten it worse than anybody else. Tell us what's happening over there.
Yeah, this is a new development in the privatization of university research. What the University of California Board of Regents did last month was they created an entity called NewCo. NewCo is a generic placeholding name for new company. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3 foundation that is being given control over UCLA's patented research and technology transfer pipeline. And it will be a board of independent private business people and investors who are essentially controlling the decisions over how to commercialize or transfer technology created in UCLA into the private sector.
And so, and I believe in your story, those are referred to as tech transfers. Is that correct?
Yeah, tech transfer is just the lingo they use. But when a university researcher creates an invention, whatever it might be a medical technology, it might be a method of conducting further research. Sometimes they'll take that and they'll patent it, and the patents are typically owned by the university. And then the university, if they want to put it out into the private sector to create a new industry or to create new products, that process is called technology transfer.
And so what happens, though, when you have corporations? I know recently BP came out and has pledged, I believe it's going to be about $500 million to the University of Illinois and as well as UC Berkeley. And so when this corporate money comes into these organizations that are, they're nonpartisan, they're, not for profit most of the time, it's a college. But when you have corporate money pulling the strings, what's going to happen to the flow of ideas within that university?
Yeah, there's always very real and concrete strings attached to these agreements. So the one you just referenced with BP and UC Berkeley, BP wrote into that agreement that they would be able to obtain the rights to the research conducted there on campus. So they get the sort of first skim of inventions and products, and that's common in these industry-sponsored research agreements between universities and companies. The more dangerous thing is also that there's a way in which this shapes the larger field of knowledge production. When an increasing amount of the research conducted on campuses is being directly sponsored by corporations, that means the very questions that are being asked, these are questions that pertain to the profit motives of these companies, not to broader public goals that the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health might have.
Right. And so again, when you have this privatization of basically intelligence, these are people who at one time were strictly supposed to be working for the public good. I know down here, we're in Pensacola, Florida, and during the BP oil disaster that took place about 3 years ago, what happened was we had a lot of local universities sending down their scientists to run tests on the oil, on the dispersants, on the tar balls, and all sorts of things like that. But then BP swooped in. I hate to go back to BP again, but they came down here and started offering, exorbitant sums of money, tens of thousands of dollars to any, college professor, any scientist who would be willing to write stories from an academic standpoint, saying that there was absolutely no danger from the oil, no danger from the dispersants, no danger from the combination of the two. And that was just for this one instance. Is that what happens when corporate money steps in and says, hey, you're a college, a university scientist. You typically don't make hundreds of thousands of dollars. So if we give you $30,000 to write one little paper for us that looks like it came from this great university study, what happens when something like that goes public?
Yeah, knowledge is a terrain of conflict, and when these powerful corporations are engaged in such high-stakes games involving environmental destruction, involving huge transfers of wealth, there's a lot at stake. And so they actively fund the production of research and knowledge that supports that agenda. Pesticide manufacturers like Monsanto are right now funding research on dozens of university campuses in the United States. And the goal on their part is to show that there are no harms to the products that they're inventing, be they like genetically modified organisms or be they certain pesticide products. There's examples of this going all the way back to tobacco. Big Tobacco funded huge studies we know on college campuses and universities, and it was entirely to protect their profit margins in the United States. And so we see this with virtually every single industry.
Right, and as we mentioned just a few minutes ago, this academic research, there was a time when this was all for the public's good. But now, especially at University of California, where you have this Board of Regents coming in, they operate just like any other corporation would in the best interest of their shareholders. So a study that could maybe determine that certain products were causing cancers could now be just tossed out in favor of a study that's going to help a company come up with a new technological advance. Is that something that could happen under this, or explain that?
Yeah, well, it was specifically what the University of California is seeing now. This new entity at UCLA, what's happening here is a connected network of powerful investors. They've attached themselves to the university, and in the last decade or so, they were able to commercialize one or two products that were created with public research funding from several departments at UCLA. One of them was the CTI scanner, which is used in virtually every hospital in the world now. Another was a cancer therapeutic treatment. And they made billions of dollars off of these two things. And they think that they can do this with many other products. But again, what we're talking about here is we're talking about federal funding of scientific research and the state subsidization of scientific research, particularly medical research, that creates these inventions. But then these very well-connected investors, they want to privatize those things. So they want to privatize the benefits of what we collectively have funded with our tax dollars.
Right, and I actually remember reading not too long ago a piece by Joshua Holland on Alternet, where he discussed the fact that a lot of these colleges are now switching to adjunct professors, so that they can bring these people on board, pay them $2,000 per class per semester, give them 3 classes, and so you have people out there who've gone through 8 years of education, they have a PhD in a specific area, and they're getting paid by these colleges they work for, roughly minimum wage. And so, again, I fear that this corporate money is going to become a significant problem in the near future as our universities and colleges just continue to lose money, lose quality staff, and just focus more on profits than on education. But unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this week's show. So Darwin BondGraham, thank you so much for joining me today. And that's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. I'm Farron Cousins. I'll be back with you again next week, right here on Ring of Fire.
witness to a political coup taking place right in front of your damn eyes. That caliber of evil needed to be held accountable in courtrooms. Billionaire mad money wasn't enough to buy democracy. Legislators don't have enough sense to think for themselves. They let Alec do it.
Here at Ring of Fire, the truth is our only agenda, so we're able to bring you the stories that mainstream media just ignored or completely got wrong.